All right, so again, just to review, the three big sources of data we have in criminology are the Uniform Crime Reports, which are aggregated by police departments and reported to the FBI, who compile the data. The NCVS, which is the crime victimization stuff, and that's a survey of Americans done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And then self-report data, which is collected by a variety of pointy-headed people like me. There's been one sort of more recent, I guess, source of data, and that's been the media with a proliferation of the internet. It's made it easy to kind of catalog and collect data from news organizations. And so the START data is actually our best data system for tracking terrorism, and that's fed in part by scans of papers from around the world looking for terrorist events. In the U.S. here, since the last couple of years and the highly publicized police shootings of unarmed citizens, one of the things we realized is that we really had no good data on how many people police shoot and under what circumstances. We'll talk about it more at the end of this class. But one of the ways we've remedied that is that news organizations have started to track the reports in newspapers to get a sort of overall sense of how much of it goes on. So it's not sort of one of the big three, but it is a sort of up-and-coming way we've started to collect data about crime. So what the big question then is, well, what do we know about crime? So is crime increasing, decreasing, doing nothing? And what things are related to crime in terms of demographic, in terms of other factors? Like, what do we learn from all this data that we've collected? And so the big story, the big you see, Timmy, in criminology is that crime has gone down pretty dramatically in the past 25 to 30 years. So violent crime, especially since the early 90s, I think 92, 93 was when it peaked, and it's been dropping like a brick ever since. It had bottomed out these last couple of years, and then 2015 was the first sort of increase we saw, which I'll get to in a bit. But it's gone down a bunch, which you'll be able to see it in all the charts. So violent crime, big story is gone way down. Property crime, a little more complex, but it's sort of followed the same trend as violent crime. That is that, as long as we've been collecting the NCVS data since the 70s, I think that like the first couple of years it went up in the 71, 72, and after that it's just been a sort of steady decline for burglary and theft and those sorts of property crimes that get reported on the UCR. So that's the big story. I'm going to go ahead and guess. You haven't put in the data yet. I'm making this video before I've seen what you guys have put, but most classes put that crime has gone up, and that's a pretty common perception amongst Americans. So here's classic example. This is the sort of long-term data on homicide in the United States, and so if you look out in 2006, I don't have the long-term chart. The next slide you'll see it goes further, but the homicide rate essentially over here has gone down below this bar, this 5 bar. So this is homicides per 100,000 population. So again, in context, the Duluth Superior sort of area is about 100,000 people, and so if we followed national averages, you'd expect to get 5 homicides in a year in this general area. We're actually now the last couple of years, 2013, 2014, I think bottomed out at 4.5 per 100,000. And if you look at that chart, that's as low as it's been since 1957, since way down here. And then prior to that, I mean, that's as low as it's been since the start of the 1900s. So we are at pretty historic lows right now for homicide and for a lot of other violent crime. Here's a chart that sort of goes from 1950 to now. I did want to back up. I mean, one of the interesting things is to look at it's kind of a double peak, right? That crime went up pretty dramatically here and here. And when we have the face-to-face class, I always ask students, like, what do those areas have in common? Like, what would explain crime going way up here and crime going way up here? And one of the things students somebody always kind of thinks of and talks about is, I mean, this is the sort of prohibition era. And so you have Al Capone and other gangsters shooting each other up to gain territory, to control alcohol. And if you think about this, this is sort of our war on drug period. I mean, it's not never as simple as just that one explanation, but it is sort of interesting to look at this chart overall and say, wow, our two biggest spikes in homicide were around times when we sort of cracked down on the distribution of illicit goods. So this is the sort of more recent data. So down here you see this is where we bottom out at about 4.5 per 100,000 people. 2015, the preliminary release showed that I think homicide went up by 6%. I don't know if that puts it back above 5 or not. I have to go look at the data. I'll talk about it in a bit, but it's kind of too early to tell whether that's just a sort of fluctuation at the bottom or whether maybe we're sort of starting to climb back up. But either way, the sort of big story is this kind of historic drop in crime. So here's property crime. The first couple of years of the NCVS data where this came from, it went up. After that, it's been going down, 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 down steadily. So the NCVS has shown as long as we've collected data that property crime has pretty much gone down. Here's violent crime from the NCVS data. So again, this would be things like assaults and robberies. And again, same story. Up about the 1990s, violent crime starts to go down. So it's nice that, in a sense, that the UCR, which is police-reported data, and the NCVS, which is victim-reported data, done in a survey, kind of back each other up. They tell the same story. Crime's gone down a bunch. What do criminologists sort of make of these crime trends? Well, how does crime go up and down? Why does this happen? And there are a kind of gaggle of usual suspects. There's no shortage of explanations for why people think crime goes up. Age composition would be, if you think like the baby boomers, you have this huge bulge in the demographic and the age demographic. And as they get to be, 15, 16, 17 years old, you'd expect that because there's so many of them and they're in their crime-prone years that crime would go up. People always point to the economy, poverty, those sorts of issues. And the sort of simple explanation that turns out to be not really true is that, if the economy tanks and people are poor, they kind of steal to get enough to eat, but not really related to violence. There is, though, when there's a severe economic downturn or when extreme poverty rates go up, one of the biggest impacts is not necessarily on the adults, but it's on the kids in the family. And so it's possible that you wouldn't see the effect of a bad economy until, 10 years later, until a 5-year-old boy is now a 15-year-old boy. So it would be a pretty hard thing to kind of study. It's something as a criminologist, I've been kicking that one around in my head, trying to figure out how you would study that. Social malaise would capture a bunch of stuff, changes in moral attitudes, sort of laissez-faire parenting strategy, permissive parents, gangs. You have various arguments about guns. Liberals tend to think there's too many. Conservatives tend to think there's too few. People will refer to justice policy. We haven't put enough people in prison. We're finally putting enough people in prison. The reality is, this is one of the most difficult things to actually predict, that criminologists have not advanced to the point where we can really not even predict. I mean, we can't even explain crime trends that have happened very well. Looking back at crime trends and trying to say, why did it go up? Why did it go down? And so there's no better sort of example of that than our huge crime drop. And it's also a great thought exercise for any of you guys. You think about, like, in your head, what do you think drives crime? What would make crime go up in a whole country? And ask yourself, if you think, well, it's a lack of gun control. Well, crime went down a bunch in the United States, violent crime, gun crime. Did we get less guns? No. I mean, we have more guns now than we've ever had. In fact, gun ownership went way up when President Obama got elected because people feared he was going to come take their guns away. What about gangs? Have gangs gotten better? Not really. The economy has kind of done its own thing. So it's an interesting thing to kind of turn turn the cause of crime on its head and say, well, can that help us explain why crime went down? What do people say? Like, what are the pointy heads say about our big crime drop? And there's a number of sort of plausible explanations. One of the ones that's gained a fair amount of traction in criminology is the crack cocaine explanation. And the idea is sort of much like the Capone Prohibition era, that we had a certain amount of violence that was associated with drug dealers trying to gain control of territory, and settle disputes on the streets and that sort of stuff. And that once that sort of waned and that war to distribute cocaine and other illicit drugs sort of settled down, you saw a decline in the violence associated with those things. And it does. I mean, it's interesting because it sort of does, the decline in crime kind of mirrors the decline, rise and fall of kind of crack cocaine. So where crack hit first, the violence hit first, and they were the first to experience then the declines in crime. So crack kind of started on the coast and worked its way in. The decline in crime 25, 30 years later did the same thing. It kind of started on the coast and worked its way in. There's been criminal justice explanations. So we've gone from having a couple 100,000 people in prison to over 2 million. And so people have said, kind of like, well, we finally got enough locked up in prison to make a dent. And there may be some truth to that if you lock up enough people, crime's going to go down. The problem with that explanation, the issue is that not every state locked up a crap ton of people. California did, Minnesota didn't, but both states saw a huge crime decline. And so one of my cautions always is to be careful of kind of the one simple explanation. The other kind of one explanation you see is the police. Both in numbers, we increased police fairly substantially in the 90s, and in tactics and our use of the internet and computers and geographical information systems to track crime and respond to it kind of in real time. Those sorts of strategies have made a difference, and the issue is to what extent they contribute. And there's a whole host of other kind of more fringe explanations. Somebody in class, I suspect, would bring up the abortion explanation that 20 years before our big crime drop was when the Supreme Court legalized abortion. And so the theory is that, there's less kids that are now born unwanted, and therefore they would have been at higher risk for being criminals. There's a number of problems with that. The biggest problem is that prior to the legalization of abortion, people were still having abortions. They were just illicit abortions, and that there was literally tens of thousands of abortions being done prior to Roe versus Wade. The other thing is that kids born to unwanted children born actually increased after the Roe versus Wade, which kind of shoots that theory in the foot. A similar explanation, and it kind of happened at the same time. So literally, if you go back 20 years from the 1990s and say what was going on, the other big story was laws that ban lead. And lead, we know that the Flint, Michigan scandal, everybody should be aware of this, but lead is a pretty toxic substance. It has its biggest impact on young children because of the way their brain is developing, and it causes problems in control and temperament related to ADHD and those sorts of things, which eventually it's related to crime as well. And so it's possible that our reduction of lead in the environment had an impact that played out 20 years later. So, and again, the data kind of works for that story, but it's sort of hard to prove cause and effect. The other interesting one that I just kind of came across, I guess I didn't realize, that the alcohol consumption declined about the same time as crime was declining. Although it's gone back up in the last few years, there's a pretty substantial decline in alcohol, and obviously there is some correlation between alcohol and violent behavior. So there are a whole host of explanations for kind of big crime drop, and the pointy heads who run the data basically find that none of these kind of explain a big chunk. That it's likely a sort of whole host of factors that relate and that help explain, and perhaps things we haven't thought of, things we haven't put our finger on, things that are sort of harder to measure. One great example of that is a sort of inner city culture that this attitude that life is cheap and it doesn't matter started to change. That the sort of children of the crack era kind of changed their ways. There's a great article about, that's the Blunt reference in there, a great article about uh, kind of having eras related to the prominent drug use in the inner city, and the heroin era and the crack era, and using that as sort of an analogy or a metaphor for what's going on. So if you think about the difference between crack cocaine and its effects, and the stereotype of people who use and compare that to blunt, um, sort of weed era, for the uninitiated, blunt is the hollowing out of a cigar and packing it with weed. Um, so the crack is a sort of frenetic, violent, prone era, and then characterizing the blunt as a sort of more chill, laid back era. The culture related to that has changed. So the big picture, the big point is there's sort of all kinds of explanations, and we have some sense of which ones hold some water, but in terms of like the reason, I don't think there is the reason. There's probably a bunch of reasons. So another really interesting question is not why did crime go down? It's why do Americans think crime is getting worse constantly? And so you see two trend lines here up on top. This is the Gallup poll, where every year we ask questions to the American public. We ask them, in the past year, do you think crime has gotten better or worse? And for the most part, 60 to 70% of Americans always say crime is getting worse. Here's the actual violent crime trend. So during this time that crime was going down, Americans said it's getting worse pretty much constantly. There is this sort of interesting drop right here, and I've thought about this a while, and my sense is probably that it was a big news story when crime first started to go down, because my whole life crime was always getting worse. So for crime to go down in the early 90s, the media probably covered it pretty heavily. But here's 9/11, and I'm guessing coverage of the crime drop sort of stopped in here somewhere as well. And so that perception jumps back up. But it is interesting, and for those of you that you thought crime was getting worse in my little crime poll, this should make you feel better that 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans put the same thing you do. There has been, and this is sort of the most recent, in 2015, this is the first year that homicide went up in a long time. And it's generated a ton of media coverage. And there's been some huge differences in big cities. So cities like Chicago and Baltimore and some other places have had really big increases in homicides, doubling, I think, in the case of Chicago. Part of the big media coverage has been this sort of hypothesis about a Ferguson effect, that there's been so much protest and bad media coverage that the police are taking this sort of hands off, like we don't want to get involved, we don't want to get the bad coverage sort of approach, and that's allowed crime to fester. There may be a kernel of truth, but we have no idea. Nobody's really studied it scientifically. And if you look at, I think I put one of them up on Moodle, I can't remember, but if you look at the sort of cities that have had scandals, some have had big increases, but some have not. New York City was racked by a couple big policing scandals. The Eric Garner scandal, where the gentleman was suffocated and died, but has had really small increases in crime, where Chicago has had all kinds of trouble with police and also a big increase. So it's too early, even I would say, up 6%. Like I said, we've probably gone from 4.5 to, I don't even know if we've reached 5 per 100,000. So is it just a blip? Is it going to be a couple of years to go up, or is this kind of the start of something big? It's way too early to tell. But it sort of is interesting times. Our first sort of change from that big downturn that has happened for the past 30 years. One of the other issues is that I've been talking up till now about the whole United States, and there is obviously a ton of variation. So here's an example showing Minnesota versus the rest of the country. The country homicide rate may be 4.5, but Minnesota's is typically much lower than that. Our robbery rate is almost half of what the national robbery rate is. And this is also a good illustration. So this is UCR data. It's a good illustration of sort of taking data with a grain of salt. Why would it be that homicide went up homicide's greater or lower in Minnesota, robbery's lower in Minnesota, but rape appears to be higher. Violence usually tends to kind of track together. So if robbery is high, rape should be high. I suspect what's going on here is that Minnesota has a really good track record of being progressive on the issues of sexual assault and rape, and doing a good job responding to survivors of sexual assault. And so I suspect, although I don't think there's a research on this, that what happened is that more rapes and sexual assaults get reported in Minnesota than other places. So it's not that more of them happen. Remember, this is data reported to the police. So it's a good example of sort of the limits of data, or at least like questioning where the data came from. One last sort of big picture question is how the United States sort of fits with other comparable countries. So how do we look compared to Canada or Great Britain or Australia? And we'll get into detail later in the semester, but basically property crime, we tend to actually be below average compared to other countries. We have lower property crime rates than other countries do. For violence, run-of-the-mill violence, assaults, sexual assaults, we tend to be middle of the pack. We tend not to distinguish ourselves from other countries. Where we are unique is homicide. Our homicide is 2 to 10 times higher than our comparable countries. And that's especially true, though not exclusively true, about gun homicides. So we may be 5 to 10 times higher, 5 to 10 times more likely to kill each other with guns, but we're also twice as likely to kill each other without guns than other countries. So gun likely has something to do with the story, but it's certainly not the whole story. All right, so that's a good place to end. The last PowerPoint movie coming up is going to be on demographics and what we know about the correlates of crime.